He hadn't opened that door for 12 years, so when the knock came before dawn, he knew it wasn't meant to be answered. The wind carried it first, low and hollow across the dry plains, rattling the loose boards of Ethan Cole's cabin like something trying to remember how to be human, and for a long moment, he stayed where he was, seated in the dark with his boots still on, one hand resting near the cold iron of a revolver he hadn't fired in years, listening, measuring, waiting for the sound to fade like most things did out here, but it didn't fade. It came again, sharper this time, deliberate, not desperate, not loud, just certain, and that was what unsettled him most, because men who feared for their lives pounded on doors, they begged, they shouted, but this knock expected to be heard. Ethan rose slowly, joints stiff from too many winters spent alone, and crossed the narrow room with quiet steps, the wooden floor answering him with soft creaks that sounded louder than they should in a place that had forgotten voices. And as he reached the door, the lantern behind him cast his shadow long across the wall, stretching it into something taller, thinner, almost unrecognizable, like the man he used to be had been left somewhere far behind in the dust, and never came back. He didn't open it right away. He never did anything right away anymore. Instead, he rested his palm against the rough wood, feeling the cold seep into his skin, and closed his eyes just long enough to listen again. Not for the knock this time, but for everything around it. The wind, the distant creak of his old fence, the low hum of the land waking up before sunrise, and beneath it all, nothing else. No horses, no voices, no movement, just that silence that didn't feel empty, only waiting. When he finally pulled the door open, it wasn't wide, just enough for the gray light of early morning to slip inside, thin and pale, carrying with it the smell of dust, and something else, something faint, like smoke after rain, and in that narrow frame, two figures knelt on his porch, still as stone, their silhouettes cut clean against the horizon. They were young. That was the first thing he noticed. Not children, but not far from it either. Two Apache sisters, their dark hair tied back in simple braids, their clothes worn from travel, marked with the long miles behind them, and though their shoulders were steady, there was something in the way they held themselves, upright, composed, that spoke of strength pressed thin by exhaustion rather than broken by it. The older one lifted her eyes first, not quickly, not with fear, just enough to meet his, and there was no pleading in them, no panic, only a quiet recognition that made something in Ethan's chest tighten before he understood why, as if she had expected this exact moment long before it ever arrived. The younger stayed still beside her, hands resting lightly against her knees, her breathing shallow but controlled, watching him the way a person watches a storm on the horizon, aware of the danger, but unwilling to run. Ethan said nothing. He hadn't spoken to another soul in months, and the words didn't come easily anymore. Not when silence had proven simpler, safer, but the older sister broke it for him, her voice low, steady, carrying the weight of someone who chose each word carefully because she knew it mattered. We need shelter. She didn't say please. She didn't explain. Just that. The wind shifted, brushing past them, tugging lightly at the edge of a worn shawl draped over the younger girl's shoulders, and for a brief second, Ethan caught sight of something beneath it. A small detail, easy to miss, but not to him. A mark, a familiar pattern stitched into the fabric that stirred a memory he had spent years burying deep enough that it wouldn't surface. And yet there it was, rising anyway, quiet and unwelcome. He tightened his grip on the door. "You're a long way from your people," he said, his voice rough from disuse, the words landing heavier than he intended, but neither of them flinched. The older sister tilted her head just slightly, studying him, and for a moment, Ethan had the strange feeling that he was the one being measured, not them, that whatever answer he gave next would matter more than he understood. "So are you," she replied. The words hung between them, simple, undeniable, and Ethan felt something shift inside him, not sudden, not sharp, just a quiet pressure against the walls he had built around himself for over a decade, and for the first time in a long while, he realized the choice standing in front of him wasn't about them. Not really. It was about the man he had decided to become when he closed this door to the world, and whether that man still existed now that someone had come knocking. He looked past them once more, out toward the empty land stretching miles in every direction, the pale light of dawn creeping slowly across the horizon. And in that silence, he made a decision that felt less like courage and more like remembering something he had tried to forget. Then he stepped back, just one pace, and opened the door wider. The door stayed open longer than it should have, letting the cold morning air spill inside and settle into every corner of the cabin as if it had been waiting years for the chance. And Ethan stood there for a moment with his hands still on the edge of the wood, watching the two sisters rise without a word, their movements slow but steady, like they had learned long ago that rushing only wasted strength. And as they stepped past him into the dim light, he caught the faint scent of sage and dust, clinging to their clothes, something clean beneath the miles they had traveled, something that did not belong to fear. He closed the door behind them with a quiet push, the latch falling into place with a sound that echoed louder than it should, sealing the three of them inside a space that had not known company in more than a decade. And for a brief second, none of them moved, as if the room itself needed time to remember how to hold more than one presence. Ethan turned away first, because that was easier, and reached for the lantern, turning the flame higher until the shadows pulled back just enough to reveal the worn edges of the room, the rough table, the iron stove, the single bed against the far wall, everything simple, everything deliberate, nothing that invited staying longer than necessary. And yet here they were. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table, his voice still carrying the weight of someone who did not use it often. And the younger sister obeyed without hesitation, lowering herself carefully onto the chair as if each movement had to be measured, while the older one remained standing a moment longer, her eyes moving slowly across the cabin, not searching, not judging, just noticing, the way someone does when they understand that every object holds a story, even the ones people try to hide. Ethan busied his hands, because stillness brought thoughts, and thoughts brought memories, and memories had a way of staying longer than they should. So he reached for a tin cup, filled it with water from the barrel by the wall, and set it gently in front of the younger girl, who took it with both hands, nodding once in quiet thanks before drinking, not fast, not desperate, just enough to steady herself. And something about that restraint made Ethan pause, because most people who came to his door, when they came at all, took what they could as if it might be their last chance. But these two, they carried themselves like they had already decided what they would accept and what they would not. The older sister finally sat across from her, folding her hands loosely on the table, her posture straight despite the faint signs of fatigue in her shoulders. And when she looked up at Ethan again, there was that same quiet recognition, not curiosity, not suspicion, something else, something that made him feel seen in a way he had not allowed in years. "You live alone," she said, not as a question, but as a statement that did not need confirmation, and Ethan gave a small nod, turning back to the stove where a pot rested cold and unused, his fingers brushing the handle as if deciding whether it was worth the effort to bring it back to life. "Been that way a long time," he replied, keeping his eyes on the iron surface, because meeting hers too often stirred something he could not name. The younger sister lowered the cup slowly, her gaze drifting to the far wall where a single object hung above a narrow shelf, a folded blanket, carefully kept despite its age, its edges worn smooth by time. And for a moment, the room seemed to quiet even further, as if that small piece of cloth carried more weight than anything else in the cabin. "You keep things that matter," she said softly, and Ethan felt the words settle heavier than they should, because he had spent years convincing himself that nothing mattered enough to keep. And yet there it was, proof hanging in plain sight. He turned away from it quickly, reaching instead for a small sack of dried beans, pouring a measured amount into the pot with a steady hand, the sound of them hitting metal filling the silence between them. "You can stay until the sun is up proper," he said after a moment, his tone even, controlled, as if setting a boundary he needed more than they did, and the older sister inclined her head slightly, accepting the terms without argument. But there was a flicker in her eyes, brief and unreadable, like a question she chose not to ask yet. Outside, the wind shifted again, softer now, carrying with it the faint promise of morning, and inside, the cabin felt different, not full, not crowded, just less empty, and Ethan noticed it despite himself, the way the air moved differently, the way the silence no longer pressed as hard against his ears. and he realized with a quiet certainty that whatever had walked through his door before dawn had already begun to change something he had believed was set in place for the rest of his life. The fire took longer than it should have, the dry wood resisting at first as if it too had grown used to the cold, but Ethan stayed with it, crouched low, coaxing the flame with slow, patient movements until it finally caught and spread, a small glow pushing back the gray that lingered inside the cabin. And as the warmth began to settle into the room, he felt the quiet shift again, subtle but undeniable, like something long asleep had stirred without asking permission. Behind him, the sisters remained where they were, their presence steady, unhurried, and though neither spoke, there was a kind of awareness between them that did not rely on words, a shared understanding that passed in the way they glanced at each other, in the way the younger one adjusted her seat just slightly when the older shifted her hands on the table, and Ethan noticed it despite himself, because out here, alone for so long, he had learned to read silence better than speech. He set the pot over the fire, the faint rattle of metal against iron filling the space, and reached for a wooden spoon, stirring slowly as the beans began to warm, the simple motion grounding him in something familiar, something that did not ask questions he did not want to answer. "You came from the south," he said after a while, not turning, his eyes fixed on the small movement of the flame beneath the pot, and the older sister's voice followed, calm and measured. "We came from where we needed to leave." It was not an answer, not really, but it carried enough truth to make anything more feel unnecessary, and Ethan let it settle, because he had learned that some things did not need to be pressed, not if you wanted them to stay where they belonged. The younger sister shifted slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, tracing the worn grain of the wood as if committing it to memory, and then she looked up at him, her eyes clearer now, steadier than before. "You expected someone else," she said, and the words landed soft, but they did not miss. Ethan paused, the spoon resting still in his hand, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet crackle of the fire. "Out here," he said slowly, "when someone comes knocking before sunrise, it usually means they are not looking for shelter." He turned then, just enough to meet her gaze, and there was no accusation in his expression, only a kind of careful honesty that had replaced suspicion over the years. "But you are still here." The younger girl held his eyes a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something that had not been said aloud, and across from her, the older sister watched the exchange with that same quiet attention, her posture unchanged, her presence steady as ever. "And you still opened the door," she replied, and there was something in her tone, something almost like curiosity, but not quite, something that suggested the answer mattered more than the question itself. Ethan looked away first, because that was easier, and returned to the stove, lifting the pot slightly to adjust its place over the flame. "Doors are not meant to stay closed forever," he said, though the words felt heavier than he intended, carrying more truth than he was used to admitting, even to himself. The older sister tilted her head just slightly, considering him, and for a moment, the room held a stillness that felt deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to listen. "Some are," she said quietly, and the words did not challenge him. They simply existed, waiting to be understood or ignored, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten again, not sharp, not painful, just present, like a memory brushing the edge of his thoughts without fully stepping into view. Outside, the light had begun to change, the first real hints of morning stretching across the horizon, pale gold pushing through the lingering gray, and through the narrow window. It slipped into the cabin in thin lines, catching on dust in the air, on the edge of the table, on the blanket hanging against the wall, and for a brief second, everything looked different, not new, not untouched, just seen. The younger sister followed the light with her eyes, then glanced back at Ethan, her voice softer now. "What are you waiting for?" she asked, and the question seemed simple, but it settled deeper than it should, because Ethan had been waiting for something for longer than he could remember, though he had never named it, never given it shape, only carried it like a weight that had no beginning and no end. He did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let the fire speak in small cracks and pops, let the morning move forward without him, and then he set the spoon aside, wiped his hands slowly on a cloth, and finally turned to face them fully, the light catching his features in a way that made the years he had lived alone impossible to ignore. Nothing, he said at last. But the word did not carry conviction, and the older sister's gaze did not shift, did not soften, did not challenge. It simply held him there, as if she knew the truth had not been spoken yet, and was willing to wait as long as it took for it to surface. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, low and consistent, the kind that did not demand attention but refused to be ignored, and Ethan stood there a moment longer than necessary, staring into it as if the answer he had just given might rearrange itself into something more honest if he waited long enough. But it did not, and behind him, the silence remained unbroken, not tense, not uncomfortable, just present, like the three of them were sharing something that had not yet been named. The older sister leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze never leaving him, and there was no urgency in her expression, no need to press further, only patience, the kind that comes from knowing time has a way of revealing what questions cannot. Nothing is a long thing to wait for, she said after a while, her voice calm, almost thoughtful, and Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the shift inside him, small but real. He reached for a bowl, then another, setting them on the table with careful movements, filling each with the warmed beans, simple food, nothing more than what was needed. And yet the act itself carried weight, because it was the first time in years he had prepared a meal for anyone but himself, and even that realization felt like something he had not expected to face. He placed one bowl in front of the younger sister, one before the older, and kept the last for himself, but did not sit right away, instead resting his hands on the edge of the table, looking down at the worn wood as if it might offer him a place to anchor his thoughts. "You should eat," he said quietly, though the words were unnecessary, because the younger girl had already begun, lifting the spoon with steady hands, her movements measured, controlled, while the older one waited a moment longer, watching Ethan with that same quiet attention. "You do not ask why we came," she said, and again, it was not a question, but it carried the shape of one, and Ethan gave a slight shake of his head, finally lowering himself into the chair across from them. "If you wanted me to know, you would have said it already," he replied, his tone even, not dismissive, not curious, simply accepting, and for a brief moment, something softened in the older sister's eyes, not enough to be called a smile, but enough to be noticed. "Most men ask," she said. "Most men are afraid of what they do not understand." Ethan picked up his spoon, but did not eat yet, letting it rest in his hand as he considered her words, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with the present moment. "Fear does not need questions," he said. "It makes its own answers." The younger sister paused at that, her gaze lifting from the bowl to his face, and there was something in her expression now, something closer to recognition than before, as if a piece of a larger picture had fallen into place. The older one nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to herself, and the room grew still again, the kind of stillness that did not press, but waited. Outside, the light had grown stronger, the pale gold deepening into something warmer, stretching across the land in long, quiet lines, and through the window, it reached further into the cabin, touching the edges of things that had not seen full daylight in years, the corners, the shelf, the blanket, and Ethan felt it without looking, felt the way it changed the space, the way it made everything seem less hidden. "They will come," the younger sister said suddenly, her voice soft but certain, and Ethan's eyes shifted to her, the spoon still unmoving in his hand. "Who?" he asked, though something in him already understood the shape of the answer. "Those who follow us," she said, and there was no fear in her tone, only a simple acknowledgment of fact, like stating that the sun would rise or the wind would turn, and Ethan felt the words settle into him, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something he had sensed the moment he heard that first knock. He set the spoon down then, the quiet tap against the bowl marking the decision forming inside him, slow, deliberate, and heavier than anything he had chosen in years. "Then you should not have come here," he said, but the words lacked accusation, lacked even regret, and the older sister met his gaze steadily. "We came because you would open the door," she replied, and there it was again, that certainty, that quiet knowing that did not ask for permission, and Ethan felt something shift deeper this time, something that reached past habit, past caution, into a place he had not visited since before he chose this life of silence. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving between the two of them, taking in the steadiness, the lack of fear, the way they sat as if they belonged in this moment more than he did, and for the first time since they arrived. He allowed himself to see them not as strangers, not as trouble, but as something else entirely, something that had come with purpose, whether he understood it or not. "And if I had not?" he asked quietly. The older sister did not hesitate. "Then we would have waited," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could, because it meant they had already decided how this would unfold, long before they reached his door, and Ethan realized then that whatever path he had been walking alone for the past 12 years had just crossed something far older, far steadier, and it was no longer his alone to choose where it led next. The words lingered after she spoke, settling into the quiet like dust that refused to be brushed away, and Ethan sat there for a long moment without moving, his eyes resting somewhere between the two sisters and the table, as if the answer to something unspoken might rise from the worn grain of the wood if he stared long enough. But nothing came, only the steady rhythm of the fire and the faint sound of wind pressing gently against the walls, reminding him that the world outside had not stopped, simply because something had changed inside. He reached for his bowl then, finally taking a slow bite, more out of habit than hunger, and the warmth of it grounded him just enough to think clearly, to feel the shape of the decision forming without rushing it, because rushing had never served him well, not before, and certainly not now. Across from him, the younger sister finished her meal in the same measured way she had begun it, placing the spoon down carefully, as if even small movements carried meaning, and when she looked up again, her eyes were clearer than before, steadier, like whatever had weighed on her when they arrived had eased just enough to let something else come through. "You are not surprised," she said, and Ethan gave a slight shake of his head, his gaze shifting briefly toward the door before returning to her. "I learned a long time ago," he replied, "that the land does not send anything without a reason." The older sister watched him closely at that, her expression unchanged, but there was something deeper in her eyes now, something that had not been there before, like a door opening just a fraction wider than it had been. "And what reason do you see in us?" she asked, and the question did not challenge him, did not demand. It simply waited, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his arms loosely as he considered her, not as strangers now, but as something more complex, something that had stepped into his life with intention whether he understood it or not. "You brought something with you," he said slowly, "and it is not just trouble." The younger sister glanced at the older one, a brief exchange passing between them that needed no words, and then she reached down, her hand moving to the edge of her shawl, lifting it just enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath since they arrived, a small leather cord resting against her neck, holding a pendant that caught the morning light in a way that made it seem brighter than it should have been, a simple piece, worn with time, but unmistakable in its shape and pattern. Ethan's breath slowed, not sharply, not suddenly, but enough for him to feel it, because he knew that design, not from memory he visited often, but from something older, something buried deeper than most things he allowed himself to remember, and for a moment, the cabin seemed to narrow around him, the space between them closing in on a truth he had not expected to face again. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly, his voice lower now, carrying a weight that had not been there before, and the younger sister did not look away as she answered. "It was given to someone who needed help," she said, her tone steady, but there was something beneath it, something that suggested the words carried more than their surface meaning. Ethan's eyes moved from the pendant to her face, then to the older sister, who held his gaze without hesitation, and in that moment, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the light, but in him, like a door he had kept closed for years had just been touched from the other side. "That is not something you find on the road," he said, and the older sister inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth in his words without expanding on it. "No," she replied. "It is something you carry until it finds its way back." The fire cracked softly behind him, a small sound that seemed louder than it should, and Ethan turned his head just slightly, enough to break the line of sight between them, because the weight of that exchange had begun to press in a way he was not ready to face directly, not yet, and for a moment, he said nothing, letting the silence settle, letting the meaning of what had been shown rest where it was without forcing it further. Outside, The light had grown stronger, the sun now fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. And with it came a subtle shift in the air, a change that most would not notice. But Ethan did, because he had spent years learning the language of the land when there was nothing else left to listen to. And that change told him something was coming, not fast, not close, but certain. He stood slowly from the table, his movements deliberate, controlled, and walked to the door, placing his hand against it once more, not opening it yet, just feeling the world beyond it, the distance, the quiet tension that had begun to stretch across the plains like a line drawn in dust. Behind him, the older sister spoke again, her voice calm, unchanged. "You feel it," she said, and it was not a question. Ethan nodded once, his hand still resting on the wood. "Yes," he replied, and for the first time since they arrived, there was no distance in his voice, no hesitation, only acknowledgment, because whatever had been set in motion before dawn had now begun to reach him fully, and he understood that the choice he made next would not be undone by closing a door or turning away, not this time. He did not open the door, not yet, because some moments were not meant to be rushed, and Ethan stood there with his hand pressed flat against the wood, feeling the faint vibration of the world beyond it, the kind that did not come from wind or cattle or anything ordinary, but from movement spread wide across distance, measured, deliberate, and growing closer one quiet inch at a time. Behind him, the fire burned low, steady, and the sisters had not moved from the table, their stillness now carrying a different weight, not of waiting, but of knowing, as if whatever was approaching had already been accounted for long before it ever reached his land. Ethan let out a slow breath, then lifted the latch and opened the door just enough to step outside. The morning air meeting him with a dry warmth that had not been there before dawn, the sky stretching clear and pale above the open plains, and for a moment, everything looked exactly as it always had, empty, wide, untouched, but Ethan did not trust what things looked like, not anymore. He stepped down onto the porch, boots settling against the worn boards, and narrowed his eyes toward the southern horizon, where the land dipped just enough to hide what lay beyond, and there it was, faint at first, almost nothing, just a thin line of dust rising against the light, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, and Ethan knew. He had seen it before, years ago, in a different life, when dust like that meant men moving with purpose, not wandering, not passing through, but coming for something. And as he watched, the line thickened, slow but certain, stretching wider across the horizon like a quiet answer to a question he had not asked out loud. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not call back into the house. He just stood there, letting the distance speak, letting the shape of what was coming form in his mind without forcing it. And behind him, the door creaked softly as it opened a fraction more, the older sister stepping just to the threshold, not crossing it, not standing beside him, simply present, her gaze following his toward the same line of dust. "They do not hurry," she said, and Ethan gave a small nod, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Men who hurry are afraid," he replied. "These ones know where they are going." The younger sister remained inside, but he could feel her attention just the same, a quiet awareness that filled the space between them without needing to be seen. And for a moment, none of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. The wind shifted again, carrying the dust a little higher now, enough to catch the light in a way that made it clearer, more defined, and Ethan counted without meaning to, not numbers, but movement, the rhythm of it, the spread, the depth, and he knew it was not one rider, not two, not even a handful. It was more than that, enough to change the air before they ever arrived. He rested his hands loosely at his sides, not tense, not ready, just steady, and after a while, he spoke again, his voice low, almost lost in the open space. "If they are coming for you, they will not leave without answers." The older sister did not look at him when she replied. "They are not coming for us," she said, and there was no doubt in her tone, no hesitation, only certainty, and that made Ethan's jaw tighten slightly, not in anger, not in fear, but in recognition, because that answer carried more weight than anything else she had said so far. He turned his head just enough to glance at her, studying the calm in her expression, the absence of worry, and for the first time since they arrived, He allowed the thought to fully form, not as a question, but as a possibility that had been waiting its turn. "Then they are coming for me," he said quietly, and the words did not sound like a guess. The older sister met his gaze then, and for a brief second, something passed between them, something that felt less like confirmation and more like acknowledgment of a truth that had already been decided long before this morning. "They are coming," she said, not answering him directly, but not denying it either, and that was enough. Ethan looked back to the horizon, where the dust had grown thicker now, the shapes within it beginning to take form, distant figures moving in a line that did not break, did not scatter, only advanced, steady and silent across the land. And he felt it settle into him fully, the understanding that whatever had followed those sisters here was not something he could turn away, not something he could ignore by closing a door or stepping back into the quiet he had built for himself. The land had brought this to him, just as it had brought everything else before, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole did not look for a way to avoid it. He simply stood where he was, watching, waiting, as the distance between him and what was coming slowly began to close. The dust did not rush, and neither did Ethan, because there was a kind of truth in the way things approached a man's land. And this was not the truth of panic or chaos. It was the kind that carried weight, intention, and the quiet certainty of something that did not need to prove itself. And as he stood there on the porch, the boards steady beneath his boots, he felt that certainty settle into him like a long-forgotten memory returning without warning. Behind him, the cabin remained open, the door left slightly ajar as if the line between inside and outside no longer mattered the way it once had. And he could hear the faint shift of movement within, not restless, not afraid, just present, as the sisters remained where they were, allowing him the space to meet what was coming on his own terms. Ethan took a slow step forward, then another, until he stood at the edge of the porch, the open land stretching out before him in miles of quiet truth. And the dust had grown thicker now, no longer a distant suggestion but a clear signal, rising in a long, low cloud that marked the steady approach of riders who did not break formation, who did not scatter, who moved as one. He did not count them, not in numbers, but in presence, in the way the earth seemed to carry their weight even from this distance. And it was enough to know that whatever was coming was not small, not accidental, and not meant to be ignored. He rested his hands loosely at his sides, fingers relaxed, not reaching for anything, not preparing for anything, because preparation implied resistance, and something deep within him had already begun to understand that this moment was not meant for resistance. It was meant for truth. The older sister stepped out onto the porch then, her movements quiet, controlled, stopping just a few feet behind him, not beside him, not in front, but exactly where she needed to be, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm that had followed her since the moment she arrived. "You can still walk away," she said, and the words were not a warning, not a suggestion, just an offering, simple and complete. Ethan did not turn. He kept his eyes on the horizon, on the growing shapes within the dust. And after a moment, he shook his head slightly, the motion small but certain. "No," he said, and that was all, because anything more would have been a lie. The younger sister appeared in the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame, her gaze moving past him toward the same distant line, and for the first time since she had entered his home, there was something different in her expression, not fear, not even concern, but something closer to respect, quiet and unspoken, like she was witnessing a choice she had already expected but still needed to see. "You knew this would happen," Ethan said after a while, his voice low, steady, and this time, he did turn, just enough to look at the older sister, to see if there was anything in her eyes that might deny it. She met his gaze without hesitation, and for a brief second, the morning light caught in her eyes in a way that made them seem older than they should have been, carrying something far beyond the years she had lived. "We knew you would be given the chance," she replied, and the difference between those two truths settled quietly between them, understood without needing to be explained. Ethan let out a slow breath, turning back to the horizon, and as he did, the shapes within the dust began to take clearer form, outlines sharpening, movement becoming more defined, riders now visible against the pale gold of the morning, their approach steady, unbroken, and he felt the distance between them closing not just across the land, but inside him as well, narrowing the space where doubt had once lived. He stepped down from the porch then, boots meeting the dry earth with a dull, grounded sound, and walked a few paces forward, stopping just short of the fence line, the old wood stretching out to either side of him like a boundary that no longer held the same meaning it once did. He stood there alone, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and behind him, he could feel the sisters watching, not guiding, not intervening, only witnessing, and that was enough. The wind moved across the plains, carrying the dust higher now, bringing with it the faint rhythm of hooves that could finally be heard, low and distant, but undeniable, a steady pulse that matched something in his chest. Not fear, not anticipation, just presence, full and unshaken. Ethan lifted his chin slightly, eyes fixed on the approaching line, and in that moment, there was no past pressing against him, no regret, no question of what should have been done differently, only the simple truth of what stood before him and the man he had chosen to be when the door opened. And for the first time in 12 years, he did not feel alone. The riders did not slow until they were close enough for the ground itself to feel their presence. The steady rhythm of hooves rolling across the open land like distant thunder that had chosen not to fade, and Ethan stood where he was, just beyond the fence line, his posture unchanged, his hands still at his sides, as the line of men came into full view, stretching wide across the horizon before narrowing into a single, deliberate approach toward him. There were many of them, more than most men would choose to face alone, but there was no chaos in their movement, no shouting, no display meant to intimidate, only order, quiet and absolute. And as they drew nearer, the dust began to settle around them, revealing faces marked not by anger, but by purpose, eyes fixed forward, not on the cabin, not on the land, but on him. The first rider broke slightly ahead of the others, not by much, just enough to mark his place. A man older than the rest, his posture straight, his presence carrying a weight that did not need to be declared, and when he raised his hand, the entire line behind him came to a stop as one, the silence that followed deeper than anything before it, as if even the wind had chosen to step back and watch. Ethan did not move. He met the man's gaze across the distance between them, and for a moment, neither spoke, because whatever needed to be understood had already begun to settle without words. Then the rider dismounted, his boots touching the ground with a quiet certainty, and he walked forward alone, leaving the others behind, each step measured, unhurried, until he stood just a few yards away from Ethan, close enough now that the lines of his face were clear. The years carried there not as burden, but as something earned. The older sister stepped forward from the porch then, followed by the younger, their presence no longer hidden, no longer waiting. And as they came to stand just behind Ethan, the man's gaze shifted briefly to them, not in surprise, not in concern, but in recognition, and then returned to Ethan, steady and unwavering. "You opened your door," the man said, his voice low, calm, carrying across the quiet space between them without effort, and Ethan felt the words land not as a question, but as a statement that required no confirmation, and yet he gave a small nod, because anything less would have been dishonest. "I did," he replied, his tone even, matching the man's without trying, and the two stood there, facing each other in a silence that did not press, did not demand, only waited. The younger sister reached up then, her fingers closing gently around the pendant at her neck, and she stepped forward just enough for the morning light to catch it fully, the worn leather cord, the familiar shape, and as she lifted it slightly, the man's eyes softened in a way that was almost imperceptible, but real enough to be felt. "He kept it," she said quietly, and Ethan's gaze dropped to the pendant, then back to the man, the weight of it settling deeper now, the memory it carried no longer distant, no longer buried, but present, undeniable. The man inclined his head once, slowly, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, something that reached beyond the moment into something older. "It was given in a night when a man chose not to turn away," he said, and Ethan felt the words settle into him fully, not as something new, but as something remembered, something that had shaped him in ways he had tried to forget. The wind moved softly across the land, carrying the last of the dust away, leaving the air clear, open, and for a long moment, no one spoke, because the truth of what stood between them had already been laid bare without needing to be explained. Then, slowly, the man stepped closer, closing the final distance, and stopped just in front of Ethan, close enough now that there was no space left for anything but what was real, and without a word, he lowered his head, just slightly, not in submission, not in defeat, but in something far quieter, far stronger, a gesture that carried respect without needing to name it. Behind him, the line of riders remained still, unmoving, their silence echoing the same meaning, and Ethan stood there, unmoving as well, the weight of the moment settling into him not as something to react to, but as something to accept, because this was not a confrontation, not a reckoning. It was something else entirely, something that did not require a weapon, or a defense, or even an answer. Only the willingness to stand and be seen for what he had chosen when no one was there to witness it. The man did not raise his head right away, and neither did Ethan move, because some moments carried a weight that could not be rushed without breaking something unseen, and the silence between them deepened, not empty, not uncertain, but full in a way that made words feel smaller than they were meant to be. The wind moved softly across the open land, brushing past the riders who remained still behind their chief, their presence no longer something that threatened, but something that stood as witness, and Ethan felt it then, not in his hands, not in his breath, but somewhere deeper, a quiet understanding settling into place, the kind that did not arrive all at once, but unfolded slowly, like light moving across the ground at sunrise. The chief lifted his head at last, his eyes meeting Ethan's again, and there was no challenge in them, no demand, only recognition, clear and steady, and for a moment, neither man spoke, because whatever needed to be said had already passed between them in the space where action had once taken the place of words. The older sister stepped forward then, just enough to stand beside Ethan, her presence calm, grounded, and she reached gently for the pendant at her sister's neck, lifting it once more so that it caught the full light of the morning, and for a brief second, it seemed to hold more than metal and leather. It held time, memory, and something that refused to be lost even when everything else had been left behind. "You gave this without knowing who would carry it," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the still air, and Ethan's gaze rested on the small object, the shape of it familiar in a way that no longer felt distant, because the memory it carried had stepped fully into the present now, no longer hidden behind years of silence. He remembered the cold of that night, the way the wind had cut through everything, the way a stranger had stood where he stood now, not asking for help, not expecting it, and how he had chosen, without reason he could name at the time, to open his door anyway. He had not thought about what would come after. He had not waited for anything in return. He had simply done what felt right in a moment that had passed as quickly as it had come. And now, standing here, with the land stretched wide around him and the weight of many eyes resting quietly on his shoulders, he understood that nothing had been lost in that choice, only carried forward in ways he had never needed to see until now. The younger sister lowered her hand slowly, the pendant resting once more against her chest, and she looked at Ethan with a softness that had not been there before, not because it was new, but because it had no longer needed to be hidden. "Some things return when they are ready," she said, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly, not from relief, not from release, but from acceptance, because the life he had built in silence had not been empty. It had simply been waiting for this moment to reveal what it had always held beneath it. The chief took one step back then, not turning away, not breaking the connection between them, but creating space where there had been none, and as he did, the riders behind him shifted, not forward, not in any show of force, but in quiet alignment, as if the moment had reached its natural end without needing to be declared. Ethan did not follow. He did not step forward or back. He remained where he was, his boots grounded in the same earth he had walked alone for years. But the weight of that solitude no longer pressed the way it once had, because it was no longer the only thing he carried. The older sister looked at him one last time, her eyes steady, clear, and for a brief second, there was something like gratitude there, not spoken, not emphasized, just present, and then she turned, walking back toward the others with the same calm she had carried since the beginning, her sister beside her, the two of them returning not as strangers who had sought shelter, but as something that had come and fulfilled its purpose without leaving anything undone. The chief mounted his horse once more, his movements unhurried, and with a final glance toward Ethan, he gave a small nod, not as a farewell, not as a promise, but as something simpler, something that did not need to be repeated. Then, without a word, he turned, and the line of riders moved with him, not rushing, not looking back, their presence fading slowly into the open land as the dust rose once more, softer now, lighter, until it became nothing more than a memory against the horizon. Ethan stood there long after they were gone, the silence returning not as emptiness, but as something different, something fuller, and when he finally turned back toward the cabin, the door still open, the fire still burning low inside, he paused for just a moment on the threshold, his hand resting lightly against the wood, feeling its familiar roughness beneath his palm, and for the first time in 12 years, he did not close it right away.